Hey podcast listeners, this is just a quick reminder that I have a book on the psychology of video games out. It's called Getting Gamers, The Psychology of Video Games and Their Impact on the People Who Play Them. You can search for that book title on your online bookseller of choice, or you can go to psychologyofgames.com/book to find out more information. Each chapter in the book addresses a specific question and tries to use research from psychology and related fields to answer it. Some examples include, why do perfectly normal people become raving lunatics online? How do games get us to grind, complete side quests, and chase achievements? How do games make us feel immersed in imaginary worlds? And then this episode of the podcast happens to overlap with one of those topics from the chapter, Do Video Games Make You Smarter? So in just a minute, I'm going to read an abbreviated version of the introduction to that chapter as a way to set up the interview for this episode of the podcast. If you like that, found it interesting, then there's plenty more in the book, as well as about 15 other questions that could be answered. Enjoy. Welcome to the Psychology of Games podcast, where you learn about how psychology and video games interact to shape our behaviors, our beliefs, and our purchasing decisions. My name is Jamie Madigan, a psychology PhD and a lifelong gamer. I write, podcast, and lecture about this stuff on psychologyofgames.com, and I'll be your host. If you ask random strangers what game really smart people play, most of them will say chess. Chances were that there were chess clubs in your school where the brainy and the nerdy excelled, and we've all seen Hollywood use this game as a trope for letting the audience know that an on-screen character is a really deep thinker.
What's that?
Schliemann attack.
Schliemann attack? Where'd you learn that from, a book?
No, my teacher taught me.
Oh, your teacher? Well, forget it. Play like you used to, from the gut. Get your pawns rolling on the queen side. Come and get me.
A chessboard in the background of a shot is better shorthand than anything else for, hey, this person's smart. And if the filmmakers really want to dial it up to 11, they'll show the character playing speed chess, where moves have to be made under time pressure. Or they'll show him attending to multiple chess games at once, perhaps on a park bench against experienced players. Or multiple speed chess. To be fair, chess has earned this reputation. The rule set is relatively simple, but anyone who has competed against an accomplished player or even a challenging computer program knows that winning a game requires very complex mental acrobatics and thinking ahead about how to counter any number of possible upcoming moves. In his book about the work of mathematical genius John von Neumann, author William Poundstone explains how one could, at least theoretically, create a table of all possible chess strategies, showing the pairings of every set of chess moves and counter moves for player A with every possible set of moves and counter moves for player B. Each cell in that table would describe an outcome of that pairing of moves and counter moves. White wins in 64 moves, draw in 104 moves, black wins in 88 moves, and so on. But the theoretical possibility of such a complete description of all possible games is somewhat lost beside the fact that such a table printed in compact 10-point font would be so large as to span several galaxies. Or slightly bigger if you use the old trick of adding 1.5-inch margins to the paper. And yet, chess has got nothing on the complexity of StarCraft. Real-time strategy games like those in the StarCraft series have competitive modes where players manage armies and economies from an overhead perspective. Games are played on maps that contain natural resources like minerals and gas. Those resources are collected and used to build or upgrade a base full of buildings. Those buildings produce a wide array of military units that are sent out to scout for and battle the enemy. Some units are more or less powerful against other units, imagine a sophisticated version of rock, paper, scissors, but with better graphics and more objects in play. Many more objects, because StarCraft games have 3 different factions a player can choose from, each of which has dozens of possible units and structures. Memorizing all these units and being able to recall how they interact is no small feat of long-term working memory. Plus, deciding on the composition of one's army requires logical reason and problem-solving. A player's choice of what buildings and units to build should be informed by what her opponent is doing. Thus, effective scouting and information gathering are as important to the game as martial might and resource management. In addition to all this, wars in StarCraft and games like it are often fought on multiple fronts requiring multitasking and the splintering of one's attention. Most matches involve expanding to a second or even third base of operations in order to pull off the far-flung resources needed for a win. And unlike a chessboard, The map of StarCraft, its game board if you will, is too large to see or interact with all in one view. Players have only limited information on what's going on at any given moment. Successful players have to click around all over the map in order to issue commands, activate units' abilities, queue up production, and keep resource collection going. Accomplished StarCraft players can switch their attention around and click their mouse buttons fast enough to perform at least 400 different actions per minute. That's almost 7 actions every second, and some elite players are even faster. Most casual players would probably only be able to do 1/8 of that on a good day. It's all mind-bogglingly complex. Even if you had several galaxies on which to write a table of strategies and counter-strategies, it wouldn't be enough, since everything happens in real time, and unlike in games of chess, a StarCraft player only has partial information about what her opponent is doing in any given moment. Yet people obviously play the game all the time. It's massively popular in the competitive gaming scene, especially in Korea, where teams of players live and train together in dormitory-like houses full of computers and bunk beds. It is literally their job to play the game all day long and watch recordings of past games so that they can compete in professional matches where only those with the experience and mental fortitude needed to master the game can come out on top. So, StarCraft players must be smarter than other people, right? Or put another way, smarter people tend to make better StarCraft players, right? Research has actually tried to answer these questions. In 2013, neuroscientists in Korea subjected the brains of 23 professional StarCraft players to an MRI in order to study the structure of their brains. The brain is a malleable and shapeable organ that will respond with tiny but detectable physical growth with use of specific areas. The Korean researchers found that the thickness of certain parts of elite players' brains was correlated with their tenure as a professional player. The longer a subject had been playing StarCraft, and the better his win rate, the more thickness he had in areas of his brain known to be associated with attention shifting, inhibition of impulses, and executive functions like decision making. Playing the game, the authors argue, literally made their brains bigger. This is similar to London taxicab drivers who must prepare for a grueling gauntlet of tests known colloquially as the knowledge by memorizing thousands of different routes through London streets. Research shows that the brain regions associated with spatial representations of environments are larger in London taxi drivers than with the general population. Another group of researchers from the University of California, San Diego, analyzed recordings of 2015 StarCraft games and considered the relationship between measures of action speed and how far apart on the map actions were on average. The researchers argued that this latter statistic served as a measure of how players were able to manage the cognitively demanding task of divvying up and allocating attention on the fly. If a player has a group of hydralisks burrow under an enemy base in one action, then upgrades a spawning pool back in his base for the next action, then orders an overlord to scout a potential expansion locale clear across the map, he's displaying what the authors describe as superior, quote, spatial variance of action. It's a hallmark of an efficient and powerful brain, and indeed the researchers found that displays of this cognitive ability predicted whether or not a player won or lost any given game. Of course, correlation doesn't signify causation. People with naturally excellent attention allocation skills may be drawn to games like StarCraft because they find that they're good at them. Or smarter people might just be naturally attracted to complicated, mentally demanding games like StarCraft or chess. So, given all this, would you think that playing StarCraft makes you smarter? Is it only real-time strategy games? What about simulation games like Civilization? Or puzzle games like Bejeweled or Peggle? Heck, what about those shooters like those in the Call of Duty or Halo series? Can those make you smarter? The answer is a definitive, well, maybe, it depends. Some researchers certainly believe that even simple games can make you smarter, or at the very least, they can help train specific cognitive abilities like memory, concentration, and problem solving. These brain training games can be found on the web, cell phones, or even dedicated gaming platforms like the Nintendo 3DS. But do they work? Does playing action games like first-person shooters work? Well,
you can get kind of very good at, the little tasks in, say, Nintendo Brain Age, but you're not suddenly globally good at reasoning or at short-term memory. You're just good at the exact thing that you were trained on. And so the reason the action games are of interest is because they do actually seem to extend beyond the domain.
In every episode of this podcast, I interview an expert on the overlap between psychology and video games. This time, we're going to talk about whether or not video games can actually make you smarter. Okay, by law, I have a few seconds now to tell you about my Patreon campaign. Patreon.com is a system that allows people like you to to support this podcast and the website by donating as little as $1 or $2 a month. This helps me pay for stuff I need to do the podcast and write the articles and keep all that going. Plus, you get Patreon-only benefits like early access to podcasts and access to audio versions of articles. So go to patreon.com/POG, that's for Psychology of Games, to get more information. Okay, we're done. All right, thanks everybody for joining me on the interview section of the podcast. Today, on this episode, my guest is Dr. Shawn Green, who has been doing a lot of research into areas that I think will be of interest to anybody who spends a lot of time playing video games and worries about what effect it may have on our squishy brains. So Shawn, welcome to the podcast. I appreciate your coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And so who are you and what are you doing here?
So I'm Shawn Green. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm in the Department of Psychology. And so my research is really in neuroplasticity and learning. So, how do we in particular learn new skills, visual skills, cognitive skills, motor skills, and how does this affect our brain? And so one domain that we're particularly interested in is in the effects of playing certain types of video games, because what we've seen is that these games promote a lot of changes in your perceptual abilities, in your attentional abilities, and in your cognitive abilities.
I guess the first question I have is, just between you and me, I mean, seriously, games do make you smarter, correct? And gamers are more intelligent than other people, right? If you need to answer in code to say something like, no, not really, or, well, it's complicated, and that'll sort of be our secret code for, yes, games do make you smarter.
Then I'll go with it's complicated.
Okay. So how so? Or let me ask, how did you get into studying this topic of what effects video games do have on our cognitive abilities and skills?
Sure. To some extent, it was serendipity. So I joined a lab at the University of Rochester. It's where I did my bachelor's and PhD. And this was Daphne Bavilier's lab at the University of Rochester, and her interest was in the effects of congenital deafness on vision. So again, the interest is in neuroplasticity, but the model that they were using was congenital deafness. So asking, how does your visual system change when you're born without the sense of hearing? What does the cortex, what does the part of the brain that's expecting auditory input do when it's not receiving auditory input? And how does this affect your other senses? And so I joined this lab as a sophomore, and my first task was to design a kind of simple visual test for the deaf, and to pilot it on individuals that were congenitally deaf and hearing individuals. And so this was the first thing that I'd ever really programmed before. So I programmed it, and I wanted to test it on myself and some of my friends. Mm-hmm. So we tested ourselves on it and looked at the results, and all of us were kind of far too good at this task based on what the norms were in the literature.
Okay, so you aced the test. You were way on the top end of the curve, huh?
Yep, and by an amount that was, not a small amount. It was, double or triple the expected performance. And so, of course, anytime a 19-year-old has programmed something and collected some data, the first obvious hypothesis is that they screwed something up. But once we ascertained that I hadn't, in fact, messed anything up, we asked, well, all right, well, let's run some people that don't happen to be my friends. And when we did that, these people patterned exactly as we would have expected from the literature.
So what was it that you and your friends had in common here?
Yeah, so this was right about the time that campus networks were starting to get kind of T1 networks allowing you to play online games really easily. And so we were playing a whole lot of Team Fortress Classic at the time. So
the original Quake mod or the Half-Life 2 one?
Yep, the Half-Life 2 mod.
Okay.
So, just pure capture the flag, Team Fortress Classic. And so, we were using it as a reward. Anytime we'd say write a function in computer science, that would be our reward. We get 1 hour of playing the game for every function. So we weren't sleeping that much, but playing lots of Team Fortress.
Spoken like true psychologists, by the way.
Exactly. It's very reinforcing. That ended up forming the basis of my undergraduate senior thesis and has kind of formed the basis of all of my work since then.
Okay, so what you found out was that people who, like yourself and your friends that played a lot of these action video games did better on the test than what you took for the population at large.
Correct. And then kind of what's really important to do after that. So, that's what we call a kind of an experiment of nature, or a cross-sectional experiment. And the issue there is it's unclear whether or not playing the video games actually causes the improvements in vision, or whether, maybe people who are born with good vision are attracted to playing these types of games because their good vision is rewarded, and people who are born with poor vision are kind of punished for that, and they tend not to play the games. So what we always have to do is actually bring people to the lab who don't naturally play these types of games and actually train them on an action game. So they come to the lab for 10 or 20 or sometimes 50 hours over the course of many weeks. And they just play this game in the lab, and we measure the effect on their vision before and after this training to actually show that it's the act of playing the game that causes the changes in vision or attention or cognition, and not some kind of innate quality that's just correlated with playing games.
Yeah, so you see, what you're describing is essentially like a selection bias, where you get people who are naturally good in the skill or gravitate towards it because they're good at it and because it's rewarding for them. And you see that a lot of times in like survey research, where they'll get a lot of people who respond like, yes, I play a lot of games, and then they'll just correlate that data with something else. But you guys actually did experiments where you would compare people who didn't play action games, or didn't play games at all, with people who did play. I'm guessing like mainly first-person shooters, those types of games?
Yep. So the way we actually do the experiments in practice is we train so we take people who don't typically play games, half of them we train on an action game, and half of them we train on some other control commercial video game that's matched for things like engagement and learning, sense of flow, identification with character, but kind of lacks the critical ingredients that we think are in action games that actually promote the perceptual and cognitive changes. So these are usually slower, kind of more life simulation games. So we've used The Sims 2, for instance, as one of the control games. And so actually what we look to see is it the case that the people who are trained on the action games improve more from their training than the people on the control game? And that for us ends up being kind of strong causal evidence of a causal relationship between playing action games and enhancements in perceptual or cognitive abilities.
So break down some of those cognitive and perceptual abilities that you're talking about. Like, what specifically are we talking about here?
So one thing that's kind of important is that we measure these in kind of your standard sterile psychology lab types of ways. So our tasks don't look anything like a video game. They're very boring black and white lines. So it's not the case that, people are, used to playing video games and they're basically doing little video games in the lab. These don't look like video games at all. So some examples, kind of starting with really low-level vision. One of the fundamental aspects of vision is what's called contrast sensitivity, which is just your ability to differentiate, little changes in the luminance of adjacent parts of the screen. And so this is important for things like, detecting edges of objects. So often the edge of an object is defined by the fact that, on one side, you've got a slightly different amount of luminance than the other. So if you think of, say, a keyboard on a desk, the amount of light reflecting off the keyboard is a little bit different than what's reflecting off the desk. And that border is a contrast edge. And so this is a fundamental aspect of vision. Without the ability to tell the difference in amount of light coming from different parts of the screen, or not the screen, the world, you really can't see anything at all. And so using kind of very sterile stimuli, they're kind of black and white. We call them gratings. They're just a pattern of black and white lines. And what we do is we show participants kind of two sequential screens. So they see a flash of one screen and they see a flash of another screen. One of the two screens has this little grating on it, and they just have to say, did you see the grating in the first screen or the second screen? And as they get that correct, what we do is we kind of make the little grating look more and more like the background gray level. So we make the black a little bit more like gray, we make the white a little bit more like gray, and we see how much contrast do you need where you can still figure out which of the two intervals the grating was in.
So is that an example of a just noticeable difference, or?
Yeah, so not so much a just noticeable difference because it's relative to nothing in this case.
Okay.
So it's, in kind of pure signal detection, it's, how much signal do you need versus the pure noise of the gray background.
Okay. So real fundamental stuff.
Correct. And so we see changes at that level. It's very, very low level vision, contrast sensitivity. And then we can go up to something that's higher level. For instance, the ability to switch between tasks. So if, let's say you're doing two tasks. Let's say you're, working on a Word document, and you get a text message that comes up. What's known is that it actually takes, say, about 200 milliseconds for you to actually disengage from your first task, the Word document, and re-engage with the text message. So during that 200 milliseconds, really all you're doing is switching between tasks. You're neither doing task one nor task two. You're just switching. And so this is called the switch cost, or the task switch cost. And it's thought to be a measure of cognitive flexibility. How quickly can you reorient your attentional resources given new demands?
And that's essentially multitasking, or what's really happening when people say they're multitasking.
Correct, because much like, a CPU, human beings don't really truly do multitasking. They don't usually do two things really in parallel. The only way people can really do things truly in parallel is if they're a kind of a true expert in one of the tasks where it doesn't require any cognitive resources. So for instance, you can walk and talk at the same time, because walking doesn't really demand much in the way of cognitive resources. But most tasks you're not actually doing in parallel, you're doing them sequentially. Every time you switch between them, you pay this cost. And so what we've seen is doing the action game training reduces the size of that cost.
So they're able to switch between tasks more quickly?
Exactly. And there are other instances, for instance, the ability to track multiple moving objects. So if I give you, the way we describe the task is, imagine that there are 10 identical twins running around in a playground, and we tell you, we want you to just track, these four. You have to pay attention to these four, and, all 10 of them run around, and then one of them raises their hand at the end, and you have to say, was this one of the, four you were supposed to track, or was this one of the distractors? We measure this with little boring circles.
Yeah, I've seen that with the little happy faces on them, and yellow and blue, yeah.
Yep, it's that exact task. And so people trained on the action games can track more items at a higher accuracy rate.
Now, when you say more, you mean like they'd be able to track like 6, whereas a non-play action gamer would be able to track 3 or 4?
So let's say, if we set a constant threshold for, let's say, how many can you track at 80% correct? It's going to be about the difference between a non-gamer can track, about 3, and an action gamer can track right about 5.
Okay.
At that level of accuracy, obviously depending on how fast the dots move and kind of all kinds of extraneous details. So that's kind of a smattering of the types of effects. We're actually working on a meta-analysis, a kind of a broad review of the literature, and there's, 50, 70, 80, I don't remember what the number is now, papers, identifying kind of individual attentional or cognitive or perceptual abilities that are improved by playing this type of game.
So it sounds like people who play a lot of action games, at least in these studies, they have better vision, at least in some ways.
Correct.
They have a greater ability to quickly switch between tasks, and they have the ability to track things in their field of view and keep track of objects.
Yep. And so one other key one is kind of the ability to filter out extraneous information. And so there are lots of kind of, so we call this selective attention. Kind of the classic example of selective attention is, if you're having a conversation in a crowded restaurant, you can, just pay attention to your dinner partner's voice and kind of not hear all of the other conversations going around. You can basically filter out all of the extraneous information. Mm-hmm. And so people who play action games, actually do a better job of this. To some extent, none of us have perfect attentional systems. We're not capable of perfectly filtering out everything that's kind of irrelevant. We can do a good job, but not a perfect job. And so people who play these types of games or who are trained on these types of games do a better job than people who are non-gamers. You get a little bit more, we say, leak through in non-gamers than you have in the action gamers.
So that sounds like something that, at least in some contexts, would take like mental energy or concentration to do, to like screen out noise and to focus on one thing. Do action gamers have more of that energy, or does it recoup faster?
It's one of the kind of difficult things is to kind of differentiate between more and better use of. So, it's, really difficult to say, do they have more attentional resources that they can devote, or are they just better able to put resources into task relevant things and suck them away from task irrelevant? At least actually done kind of EEG, so functional brain imaging kinds of work. And what it looks like is that really what the gamers are good at is taking resources away from task irrelevant items. So they're not disproportionately good at kind of attending to the task relevant items, but they're very good at filtering out the task irrelevant. And so that seems to be where the difference is between the non-gamers and the gamers, not how much they can put into the task relevant, but how well they take stuff away from the task irrelevant.
That's interesting. It just seems to fly in the face of all the things that so many mothers and fathers have probably said to their kids about, little, Jimmy or Betty can't concentrate and can't pay attention to their homework because, video games or whatever has ruined their ability to do that. But it sounds like what you're saying is that it actually enhances their ability to do that.
Well, I guess there's a couple of key points there. So usually, at least in the lay audience, when people talk about attention, they're using what we would call in psychology sustained attention or vigilance, which is really the ability to stay on task, usually in a low information kind of boring environment. So if you think of, say classic classroom attention, you're trying to stay on task when, say, a teacher is writing in cursive on the board. If you convert this to kind of bits of information per second coming in, it's actually very low. And so, vigilance is the ability to stay on task despite the fact that not much is happening. It's not clear whether this particular ability is changed in action gaming or not. This, ability to stay on task when things are dull. It's clear that they're good at filtering stuff out when, there's a combination of task relevant and task irrelevant information. The other kind of key point is that there is kind of a difference between the ability to actually do it and whether or not you think it's a good idea. And so, if you've got the belief that, say, let's say you've grown up playing action games and you kind of have the belief that, well, if nothing is happening, what that means is maybe I'm in the wrong place and I need to explore something else. Usually that's true. If you're playing an action game and nothing's going on, you can't find any enemies, you're probably in the wrong place. You should
time to press forward. Yeah,
do something else. And so if you kind of have that hierarchical belief, maybe you go into a situation where you're, say, in a classroom and nothing is happening. The inference then is, well, maybe I should look around. And so that could always manifest as, fidgeting or, looking at other children. So, I think that's an area that we're looking at right now, is kind of this scholastic type of attention and what the effects are from both action games and other types of games.
That's funny. It makes me think of an incident when I was a kid in school, and I got yelled at by my teacher because apparently I got bored with whatever she was talking about, and I just got up from my desk and wandered over to some books or something just out of the blue, completely. I think it was when I first started going to school and I hadn't quite grasped the social intricacies of the classroom yet.
It can at least be one where it's, that it is sometimes difficult to separate, whether you are capable of sitting in your seat versus whether you think you should.
Yeah.
And those can, you can have the same behavior for different reasons. And so that ends up being one that's important for us in terms of what the mechanisms are. We actually want to know what the reason is, not just the outcome or not just the behavior.
Their correlation, yeah. So what about these more executive functions that do take, that aren't just perceptual, they do take effort and volitional intent? Is there any relationship between those types of things and gameplay?
Yeah, the best kind of examples of those are things like, the task switching or, what we would call multitasking, which are usually kind of sequential tasks. Or there's one that's used commonly in the military called the attribute task battery. Basically, you have to monitor a whole host of different instruments simultaneously and kind of respond to them at the correct interval. So it's partially a planning task, it's partially a complex monitoring task, it's partly a task switching task. And you see kind of improvements in those types of things. So that's kind of what we would call executive functions, is the ability, to kind of use some amount of volitional control to kind of put resources where they need to be at any moment in time.
So, I'm hearing you all say this, and it makes all of it makes sense. I think about what it takes to be good at a first person shooter. When you're looking at a scene, to have sharp vision, to see things on the screen, to be able to, differentiate between the border of one thing and the beginning of another thing, and to identify things quickly and switch between, do I have enough ammo? What's going on with the score? Where are my teammates? Being able to track in sort of 3D space, like where things are and so forth. So, it all kind of lines up, but I'm still left with the question of why do action video games benefit these types of activities and these skills when other activities don't?
And one of the reasons why the action games are interesting, because again, it does kind of make intuitive sense. Oh, well, these are very demanding games. They place load on all these systems. Doesn't it make sense that you would be good at all these things? To some extent, that actually flies in the face of what we tend to see when we try to train people's vision or their cognition. It's really well known in these fields that people can improve at pretty much any task you have them do over and over and over and over again. But by and large, we get no what we call transfer to new tasks. So for instance, if I train you to make a really fine discrimination, I'm going to show you just one line on the screen, and you have to say whether it's tilted clockwise or counterclockwise from, say, 45 degrees. So on the angle. You can get really, really, really very good at that task, down to the, ability to, make detections on the, part of a degree. Very, very good at that task. If then all I do is I rotate the line by 90 degrees, and now you have to make the exact same judgment, but around 135 degrees instead of 45. What you'll see is that none of that ability that you learned at 45 degrees actually transfers to 135 degrees.
So they're back to square one, huh?
Yep, you start from scratch. So this is true kind of in lots of domains. It actually tends to be very true of lots of the brain trainers. You can get kind of very good at, the little tasks in, say, Nintendo Brain Age, but you're not suddenly globally good at reasoning or at short-term memory. You're just good at the exact thing that you were trained on. And so that's, I would say, the typical result in training. You get good at what you practice, but you don't really get good at kind of anything that extends beyond that. And so the reason the action games are of interest is because they do actually seem to extend beyond the domain.
Why is that, though? Why action games and not these other practicing specific tasks or slivers of skills?
So, I think one of the dominant theories in the domain is that variety is key to promoting generalization. So one of the nice things about action games in terms of promoting transfer or generalization is that it's really the case that you never literally do the same thing twice in an action game. You're never in literally the exact same position with the same enemies, with the same kind of health and ammo. And so because of this, you have to learn something that's slightly more general. You kind of have to learn how to use your vision flexibly. You can't just learn, when I see this dot here, shoot in this way. You can't learn any of these kind of direct mappings, these direct correspondences between a visual input and an action. You have to kind of learn to use your attention flexibly because of the fact that there are no kind of repetitions. There's nothing that you can learn at the specific level, as compared to, say, many of the brain trainers where, you will see the exact same thing over and over and over again. And so that lack of variety ends up being one that tends to promote task-specific learning. Whereas in the action games, the kind of high amount of variety seems to promote more generalization.
Okay. That makes sense. And I want to come back to those brain training apps and websites and services. But again, just kind of on this idea, how much do you think motivation is involved? So if you sit me down and you're like, did this line rotate at all? That's kind of boring. But if you sit me down and say, capture the flag or, win this game of deathmatch or whatever, that's a lot more interesting, and I'm probably going to be way more into it. Does that affect sort of my skill development at all?
Yeah, so things like motivation and reward and arousal, we would call them necessary but not sufficient conditions. So, those tend to be, present in games. So we actually know, for instance, that the same system that processes reward in humans, so this is kind of the system that's active, say, if you take a drug of abuse or if something good happens to you, you get this little jolt of reward, is actually the same system that is very permissive to neuroplasticity.
Sorry, what does that mean?
So the idea is that by and large, the adult brain doesn't really want to change very much. It has a pretty good idea of the way the world works. And so it doesn't really want to change. Actually, changing your brain is metabolically costly. You have to synthesize proteins. You have to transport them. It's not a cost-free endeavor. Mm-hmm. And so by and large, the adult brain is kind of very resistant to learning. And so the only way that you can really get learning is if you, to anthropomorphize the brain here, you convince it that it's worthwhile. And so the things that are worthwhile are the things that are predictive of reward. Mm. And so you tend to find that situations that are very rewarding also tend to promote lots of plasticity in the brain. And so video games are one that we know really strongly activates the reward system. And so it's not surprising that they permit or that they also produce a whole host of neuroplastic effects.
Okay, so they activate the same types of systems in the brain that would be activated by finding something good that would help you survive or reproduce or be safe.
Yep, exactly the same system. And actually at the same level as there's actually a study that was done in the late 90s where they compared the activation in the system when you play a video game and when you get a recreational dose of methylphenidate, which is Ritalin, or amphetamines. And they're actually pretty similar in terms of the magnitude of the brain response. It's actually a very powerful response, the brain's response to video games. Can be very good in terms of driving neuroplasticity. It can have some downsides as well, but in terms of learning, it's kind of really strongly promotes learning.
Much more so than limited variability and just practice this one task over and over again.
Yep, something that is boring and rote won't tend to promote very much learning, and what learning it does promote won't generalize very far.
Okay. So why action games? It seems to me that, you look at other types of games like a real-time strategy game like StarCraft or MOBA like League of Legends or Dota. You're doing a lot of the same things, like you're divvying up your attention or you're quickly switching your attention. You're noticing things on the screen. You're reacting to them. You're being rewarded for all of that. Why do these things happen with action games and not other types of games?
So in terms of the other types of games you mentioned, like the real-time strategy games or the MOBA games, we actually don't know if nothing happens from those. This is actually, this is a field that's had to evolve along with the video game industry. So when we first started studying video games, there was the first-person shooters, and then pretty much everything else was slower. So, this was, Final Fantasy VII, so it's still turn-based. Warcraft was still turn-based. You'd have Sim City or Civilization. The other genres were much slower, didn't really have any action components. Mm-hmm. And so what we've seen over the last 15 years is that, we have lots of these new genres, like real-time strategy or MOBA. We also have a whole host of kind of hybrid genres. So for instance, most role-playing games now have an action component. Mm-hmm. There are games like Skyrim, which can be played basically as a first-person shooter, but has role-playing components, or Mass Effect that can be played as a third-person shooter, but again has role-playing elements. And so this has made kind of the study of games much more difficult because of the fact that we no longer really have these pure genres anymore. And so kind of the goal of our current research program is to get at the level of mechanisms. It used to be the case that we could use genre as a proxy for mechanism.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine that works as well.
It doesn't really work at all anymore. We have too many games that have too many overlapping features, and it's not clear which ones are the causal ones. So we've actually just finished up in collaboration with Eli Media and building a research-grade action game. Kind of one major problem with studying games is that it's difficult to test real hypotheses because we can't make an intervention. We can't take a game like Call of Duty and say, what happens if we change Call of Duty in this way? How does this affect the learning? because we don't really have access to the code in that way.
Yeah, you can do very limited stuff. Like I've, seen mods that would make things non-violent, or let's have you use the Wiimote instead of a gamepad to control the action. But yeah, I take your point.
Yep. So at the level of, can we change the amount of clutter, or, can we change the need for, look ahead? Can we change the literal amount of variety? Not really possible with commercial games. So we have a game that we're currently studying where it was basically built where we have sliders along, I think 50 or 60 dimensions. So we can basically create different versions of games that differ along one very clearly specified dimension, and then look at the effect of that. And so kind of that's the direction that we're heading, because of this fact that, the commercial game space has kind of gotten very convergy, shall we say. Almost all games now have some mixture of an action component. Most pure action games try to layer in some role playing. Mm-hmm. They all just build off what's successful, but then you don't have these clear divisions anymore.
Yeah, you might see more of that in like the indie game scene, but probably not enough to suit your needs, I would imagine. So who were you working with to develop that game?
So it's a company called Eline Media. So they produce kind of games for Impact. It's one thing that we took really seriously in putting this together is that, often when academics produce games, they try to produce them themselves or, with their IT guy. And that's just not a good route to making games.
Yeah, it turns out game designer and programmer and artist are actual things and actual areas of expertise.
It's like lots of people can read a book, not that many people can write a good one.
Yeah.
And so lots of people can play a video game, almost no one can make one that someone wants to play. And so it was important for us to, not be the game designers. Here's the general feel we want, here are the types of things we want to be able to manipulate. And so, it's a good process to actually work through and say, all right, well, what can you give us sliders on, and how does this actually map into psychological space? If what we can do is change the rate at which enemies regenerate, how does that alter the type of cognitive processing that has to go on?
Wow, I look forward to reading that research. That should be really interesting. And if you can dial in what to do to make a game teach skills better, then I see huge applications for that in like serious games and education and all these other types of things that people are kind of fumbling with, to be honest, in a lot of ways.
Yep, and lots of times, lots of they're not necessarily kind of one big problem in that sphere is that it's very difficult to extrapolate from one project to another because they're kind of little empirical islands. They tried to make a game to do X, and it either works or it doesn't. But it's not, it's difficult to relate it to this other little empirical island and this other one. And so kind of the hope is if we understand things at a more mechanistic level, we can say, all right, well, here's the mechanism that we want to promote. How do we actually instantiate this in this game for, say, rehabilitation after stroke or from certain visual deficits or to teach certain skills?
Yeah. So what are some of the practical applications of this stuff? Like what could it be used to build or do?
So typically we talk about two types of populations that can be helped right now by these games. So there are groups that are literally using, off-the-shelf commercial action games for kind of real-world purposes. So one kind of broad category is rehabilitative purposes. So for instance, there's a condition called amblyopia, which is colloquially known as lazy eye. Mm-hmm. And so basically what this is it's poor vision in one eye that's not due to the kind of optics of the eye. So you can't fix it with glasses. It's kind of a problem of neural processing. And usually it develops because early in development, your brain is expecting the two eyes to give you the same kind of overlapping input. And if this doesn't happen, the brain basically learns to ignore one of them. So often you get amblyopia from childhood strabismus, where the eyes are misaligned. When the eyes are misaligned, the brain learns to ignore one of those eyes. And the problem is that if you then fix the alignment, it's difficult to get the brain to actually pick back up that other eye. The problem is that, once you reach adulthood, again, the adult brain doesn't want to change very much. So how do you actually push it to start to, respond to that eye again? And so there's been several groups, including one at UC Berkeley, that have literally trained people with amblyopia adults with lazy eye on an action game. So what they do is they patch their good eye. So people with amblyopia have one good eye and one bad eye. So they put a patch over the good eye and they make them play the game with the bad eye. And so they've seen kind of pretty sizable changes. It won't always recover total function. Often their vision is very, very poor in the bad eye, but, they get a change of, say, about 2 lines on an eye chart. So it's a meaningful change.
Yeah, that's significant.
For an adult. So those kinds of rehabilitative purposes are one. And then the other are job skills. There's certain jobs that require different types of perceptual cognitive abilities. And so one of the most widely studied is in endoscopic surgery. This is kind of a real world application that actually has very strong similarities with the types of things you do in a video game. So, not just the perceptual and cognitive demands, but the fact that you're, say, using your hand to make translations kind of on a screen. There's actually quite a lot of research showing that training on action games actually, say, promotes the ability to learn endoscopic skills. In the cross-sectional work, they've actually seen that hours of video game playing is a better predictor of positive surgical outcomes than many things you might think are more predictive, like number of surgeries completed or training. It ends up being a pretty sizable effect in endoscopic surgery.
Is it more predictive than are you a surgeon or not?
So no.
Okay. Well, there go my plans then.
Yeah. Actually, I kind of working on some of these, I've got to use some of these little simulators. And so I did one where I was just feeding a catheter up, kind of through the femoral artery and was supposed to pull a blockage out. And so I had this whole thing to complete. And at the end, I finished it and the doctor said, "Oh, well, that's the fastest time I've ever seen. Of course, most of your maneuvers were inconsistent with human life."
Yes, you killed somebody. So
yeah, presumably multiple times.
I didn't even know that was possible. Good job.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, well, that all sounds pretty interesting. And I can also imagine things like training pilots or people that have to, perform simulations or remote surgeries or that type of stuff would be applicable as well.
Yep. So drone pilots are another major place that we've looked at, and that's of interest. The military is obviously using drones more and more frequently, and so actually how to train people to fly these. It turns out it's not that difficult to fly them. What's most difficult is landing them without breaking them. And so, people, their interest is, can you take people who just happen to have a lot of action game experience? They're probably not going to be good the first time. They're going to have to go through the simulator, but can they potentially learn to fly these more quickly, basically cut the training costs? Mm-hmm. And that does seem to be true. They start better than, recruits who don't have any gaming experience, and they reach criterion levels of performance faster.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about these brain training programs and games and services. It seems to me like there's a range of things from like the Brain Age games on the Nintendo handhelds up through, much more slick, better marketed programs where you could go on and you play these little games, you play a suite of these little games so many hours a week, and it's supposed to improve things like working memory and multitasking and, a lot of the same things we talked about, but some additional ones as well. What's the scientific consensus on these things? I have a mother, she's in her early 80s and she's got the brain of an 80-year-old, which is to say that it's starting to slow down and having trouble with memory and those types of things. Should I put her on one of these?
Yeah, so there was actually, I was part of a group that was led or put together by the Stanford Center on Longevity and the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, basically kind of developing a current consensus on the brain training industry. And so to some extent, we'd say there's no compelling scientific evidence. It's one that I kind of try to be very cautious with because, in the same way that video games aren't one thing, there's lots of types of video games. Brain training games are also kind of not one thing. There's just so many of them out there. And so some of them have some evidence, some have no evidence whatsoever. I'd say in general, kind of at least the consensus is that there's not compelling scientific evidence that many of these things or most of these things actually promote general cognitive enhancement.
Okay, so unpack that for me. What does general cognitive enhancement mean?
So what it would mean is that they lead to increases in ability outside of the game domains. So people will definitely get better at the little games that they train on. The question is whether they suddenly, can remember their keys, whereas before they used to always lose their keys, or, whether they drive more safely, or, they lose their language less often, or kind of have fewer slips of the tongue, these kinds of kind of more real world types of outcomes. And there's just not strong evidence yet on that front. And so I'd say that's the general consensus. Again, it's hard to kind of draw global, because there are some companies in this sphere that are very good actors. They actually try to do well-controlled studies where, one issue in the elderly population is doing anything cognitively interesting will actually promote a little bit of benefit, especially kind of, say, the institutionalized elderly, where they have kind of a very impoverished environment. Doing anything in that population will lead to benefits. And so there are some companies that, will compare, their product to kind of just, say, arousal or novelty, kind of a real control. Other companies don't do any research whatsoever, and they'll just say, based on the science of brain plasticity, your brain can something. And so I'd say there's a big mixture. And at the moment, there's not great regulation. So the FDA won't regulate this industry because there's kind of no potential for harm that they see. The FDA is only going to regulate something if there's potential that it could harm someone. It's not clear that playing any of these are going to do damage.
Yeah.
And so the only governmental agency that's regulating the industry at the moment is the FTC, is regulating
like advertising claims.
Yep. And so even there, it's kind of a big problem because they're used to regulating, say, the herbal supplement area, where you can, say, do a double-blind control study on, say, melatonin or, I don't know, St. John's wort, or, you can use the medical model.
Mm-hmm.
Behavioral training, we can't use the medical model because you can't hide from someone what they're doing in behavioral training. You can't hide from them that they're playing an action game. They know they're playing an action game.
There's no placebo, yeah.
Yeah, so there's no equivalent of the sugar pill. And so this is something that we're kind of struggling with in this industry or in this domain is how do we control for, say, placebo effects when we can't hide what they're doing from them? We can't have a sugar pill group. That's kind of where the field is at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like like I said, there's a range, and some of them make really bold claims like this can be used to successfully treat Alzheimer's, disease. And you look at something like that and you're like, yeah, that sounds like a medical claim, and I don't see a lot of evidence for that. Or following this program will make you more intelligent, will increase your general cognitive ability, which seems like a really far-flung claim as well.
Correct.
But then you get down to some of these like, well, this will improve your working memory, or this will improve your ability to multitask, and those types of things, where it seems a little more gray.
Well, most of them, so it's like one thing I've started paying more attention to. So I don't have any kind of commercial interest. I'm not really interested in commercializing the research, but it's because it's an area that I work in. I paid a lot more attention to it recently, and most of the companies will use kind of very carefully crafted language. So they won't literally say, this will improve your intelligence. They'll say, it is possible through training to improve, your reasoning faculties. Our thing was designed by scientists. At no point, though, do they actually say, our thing will improve your reasoning abilities. So nothing they say is literally false, despite the fact that they're often very clearly attempting to lead to a false intuition.
So, okay. Where do you think this line of research needs to go next? And sort of relatedly, like, what are you and your colleagues working on?
So some of the areas that we're kind of most interested in are, as I mentioned, kind of unpacking the actual mechanisms that underlie these changes, because then we can, build custom games for certain populations. So, for instance, action games don't have to be violent. There are examples of non-violent action games, but it tends to be the case that most action games are. And so they're not necessarily appropriate for all users, for instance, children.
Or my mother, yeah.
Yeah, also true, yeah. And so, if it's possible to know what the key mechanics are, well, then we can, say, build a non-violent action game that has the same benefits, or that's kind of very tuned for specific types of deficits. The other interest that kind of we have at the moment is actually better understanding what's happening at the level of the brain. So what areas of the brain are actually changing when you play, certain types of games. So, we're doing studies right now with Andrew Alexander at the University of Wisconsin, kind of looking at brain changes from playing, what I call kind of simpler games like Guitar Hero. Guitar Hero is one that we're starting with because it's very strongly just a visual motor type of game. Mm-hmm. So we're, all right, can we actually start to assess how the brain has structurally changed to support the ability to play Guitar Hero really well? And then the hope is to layer up to the more kind of complex types of games like, first-person shooters, and actually ask, what's changing at the level of your neurons when you're playing these games?
All right. Well, I think we covered a lot of ground here. This is all really interesting. And like you said, it's an evolving field of study that I hope more people, pick it up and continue to run forward with it, because it's really cool and seems like it has big implications. So, kind of as we wrap things up here, a couple of questions I always like to ask my guests. The first is, have you been playing anything, or what have you been playing? You got time to play any video games outside of work?
Yeah, a little bit. I've been playing the new Metal Gear game, Phantom Pain. I have been Fultoning
everything.
Afghanistan. Yeah, pretty much anything I can stick a balloon on. I've been doing that. I have a well-known tendency to basically refuse to play the main storyline until there are no side quests.
That's a lot.
Yep. So at the moment, I'm just wandering around Afghanistan, putting balloons on things. So.
Yeah. I finished that up a while ago, maybe a couple of weeks ago as well. I had never played any other Metal Gear games beyond more than an hour or two. So I had no idea what was going on or who these people were, but man, I was having fun Fultoning sheep.
Yep.
And
I'm in the same vein. I haven't played since I didn't have a PlayStation 3, so I didn't play any of the intermediates. And why do I have a horn? I have no idea. Whatever. These guys turn red. Clearly I should shoot at them.
Yeah.
That's all I need.
Yeah. And I played, I thought I was finished. Like, there was a big boss battle, and I saw credits, like more credits than they normally play after each mission, and thought I was done. But then apparently, like, there's another 20 missions after this point. And I just said, I'm going to pretend that didn't happen.
That you actually finished?
Yeah, I'm going to pretend that I finished, because this seems like a good wrapping up point. And by that point, I was ready to move on. But I really had fun with that game.
I have problematic 100% completion personality, so...
it's going to take you a while for that, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Man, anything else?
I think that's mainly, it's like I pretty much only have, I've been playing Rocket League with my younger brother. So,
that's a good one.
As a kind of more a social thing than anything else. It's kind of an opportunity my brother and I are not the types that would sit on the phone and, have a conversation about our day, but, we will play games together and kind of talk there. So
hey, whatever works.
A nice social tool as well.
Yeah. Well, we're getting into the thick of it with the holiday season. There's all kinds of stuff coming out.
I have a Christmas tradition of being disappointed by Assassin's Creed. Looking forward to that.
I hear the new one is actually really good.
That's what I'm hoping.
Yeah. I skipped the last one as well, and I think I'm probably going to pick the new one up maybe in like 4 or 5 months when it's on sale and I kind of need something to play. But yeah,
and it's been through beta testing, which is the first 200,000 saps that buy it.
Yeah, exactly. After a couple of day one patches that last for 6 months. Yeah, I picked up Halo 5 recently and played through the single player campaign on that, and gonna get into the multiplayer. And then at the time of this recording, Fallout 4 is getting ready to come out in just a matter of days, so I'm gonna be playing that. If somebody wanted to find you on the internet and follow you or see what you're up to, where would be a good place for them to go?
I'm pretty sure if you search for Shawn Green, you get me. If you search for Shawn Green, you get the baseball player. But if you search for Shawn Green, I think I am the best Shawn Green.
Okay.
Or else my webpage is on the University of Wisconsin psychology page. So it's really easy to get me from there. But yep, if you just do a Google search for Shawn Green, it's the first one that comes up.
Awesome. Find out what's going on. All right. Well, I really appreciate your coming on. Like I said, this is really cool, and I am definitely going to keep an eye on it going forward.
All right. Not a problem. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for reaching the end of another Psychology of Games podcast. If you enjoyed this, or heck, even if you didn't, here's a few things you can do at psychologyofgames.com/podcast that cost you nothing, but will help me out a lot. Find the link to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes or your other podcatcher of choice. Or you can just search for Psychology of Games in whatever you use to manage your podcast. Follow the link to iTunes and give me a rating or review. This helps get the podcast promoted on iTunes and brings in lots of new listeners. Follow me on Twitter, Facebook, or RSS, which will get you notified when a new article or a podcast gets posted. And of course, you can kick $1 or more my way via Patreon. The link to patreon.com/POG is there as well. So thanks again, and I will see you next episode.